Okay, so here we have the Pulsar IPA25 compressor, and this is quite a beast of a compressor. At first glance, it looks like an API 2500 emulation, and it is a very accurate one, but it extends way past the hardware into some really interesting new areas, and it's quite a deep plugin. So we're going to look at that. And we're going to listen to some audio examples after I've gone through the controls on various sources. Creating these videos takes significant time and effort. Supporters of the channel make it possible for me to continue to make more. If you find these videos useful and interesting, I invite you to support the channel. There are a range of things you can do. You can make a direct donation of any amount, become a monthly patron, buy some of my music, or buy some merchandise. I also have a range of courses available that cover all essential aspects of mixing, from getting started right up to advanced techniques. Links to everything are in the video description below. And finally, click that like and subscribe button. Thanks. So I'm going to start down here in the compressor section. And I'm not going to go through every detail of this because it really is quite a deep plugin. It's deeper than it looks. And there's a lot of tonal variation, a lot of different things you can get out of this, much more than it looks like on the surface of it, because things interact in really interesting ways. Partly that's the reason. So just going through here, like the hardware, we've got the threshold ratio. Although it's not stepped, you can make it stepped if you want, but basically you can set anything in between. It's got the knee setting like the hardware. 3 settings here. It's got attack, release. The release is a variable release, and that's one of the things that they explain in some of their literature, that they spend a huge amount of time and effort is modeling the release, which on the API 2500 is a very complex and unusual release characteristic. It's not at all straightforward, and they spend a huge amount of time getting that exactly right. And so that is operating the whole time here, that variable release, based on what you set it here. A little bit different from the hardware in the fact that you get 2 knobs there, but they've decided to do it slightly differently here, and they explain why that is in the manual. It's got makeup gain here, auto makeup, which is useful. Doesn't always work for every type of compression, but it works for some, and you can't make it work perfectly for all compression, because compression is, by its very nature, changing the perceived loudness, even if it isn't louder, and you can, to some degree, try to judge what the perceived loudness is going to be using, various methods. But in some types of compression, it's impossible to get it exactly right. And so that's not any criticism of them. I think they've done a great job with this, but just to show you that, just to explain that it's not always going to perfectly match it to the subjective ear. But it often works, and it's great to have. Mix control, and then we've got clipper limiter section. This is interesting because they've added some really useful stuff here that give you more tonal creative controls than you would at first glance realize, but when you spend some time with it, you realize that it gives you a huge amount of tonal variation here, and I'll explain why that is. So you've got the ceiling control that decides, what's the loudest that's going to be allowed through the clipper or limiter. And anything below that's going to get clipped or limited. And then you've got choosing clip or limit. Now, the limiter acts like a look-ahead limiter. That's a lot cleaner, obviously, than a clipper, which is going to just clip off anything that goes over the ceiling here. The type of clipping they've done is a really nice sounding saturation, creates a nice saturated sound. It's not like hard clipping. And for me, that's really useful because the kind of music I do, jazz, world music, progressive rock, classical, most of it's not wanting to be too loud. The idea is to keep hi-fi sounding and keep as much dynamic range as possible. So limiting is enough for that. You don't need to clip it and limit it. But for some styles of music, you need to get that loudness up, and the clipping that distortion that clipping brings in can kind of be part of the sound. And the kind of music I specialize in, you're not after getting that kind of distortion. You're after more of a hi-fi sound. So I don't use clippers when I'm mastering, unless a client specifically requests it or something. But in the context of this, it can be useful literally as an effect. If you use it to kind of add saturation to the transients, it can sound really great as an effect. And here's where this gets really interesting, is because you can move where this clipper limiter sits in the signal chain. You can put it before the compressor. So you could clip the loudest transients, and that can be useful so the compressor doesn't have to work so hard and you don't get so many compression artifacts. If you don't mind some of the loudest transients getting clipped, and it might be a situation where it's not going to be that audible because it's only the odd one, but you're finding that you've got a good compression setup, but the odd loud transient really way over compresses and sounds like, you know, an audible compression artifact. You could put the clipper on that would just grab those and let the compressor work in a more within its sweet spot the whole time. Obviously, in some situations, you'd hear that clipping and you might not want to hear that. It just depends on the material you're working with, but it's nice to have that as an option for some situations. If you move it to pre-mix, then it sits here between the makeup gain and the mix. So in this situation, you've already compressed it and it's working with a compressed signal rather than working with the raw signal. And that means that there's a lot more of the signal's going to hit the clipper. Because, well, depending on how you set the compressor up, that may or may not be true. But in many scenarios, it's going to be true that you've lowered the dynamic range, and therefore you're going to get more of the signal potentially hitting the clipper or the limiter. And again, that can be used as an effect where you can get in quite a lot of strong saturation on the peaks. And that's a sound, and that can sound really great as an effect. So that's really nice to have as a kind of in the toolbox for when you need that kind of thing. Obviously, again, it's an obvious effect. It's, you know, it's something you want because you want that sound. And then you can put it post-mix, which means it happens after the mix control. And again, that's useful because you can have the dry signal hitting the limiter. As you know, if you're mixing in the dry signal, that hits the limiter as well. Whereas if you put it pre the mix, then that dry signal is going to escape the limiter or clipper. So all those variations give you quite a surprisingly powerful set of tonal shaping tools that you can use this with. Then you've got the output control. That's the output for the whole compressor, the whole plug-in. Now moving down here is where it gets really interesting. They've added in here MS and left-right separate controls. Now this is really great, and the hardware doesn't have this. So there's a number of things down here the hardware doesn't have. So what's interesting about this isn't just that it's mid-side, but that, in other words, not just that the stereo compressor is split so that it's acting separately on the mid and the side instead of left and right, which you switch to by this. But if you click on M or S, you get separate control of M and S channels. Fantastic. This is really great and very powerful. Especially in a mastering context, but even on a mix bus. So say you wanted to create some real punch on the snare on your mix bus, or on the drums in general, or even on your drum bus, but that was affecting the cymbals in an adverse way, was making them pump. But you could set up something that creates punch on the mid channel, where your kick and snare is, and then move over to the side channel and have a completely different compression setup. Set the ratio a lot lower, you know, set the attack and release so that it's a lot smoother, and have a really different effect. So that's very powerful. It's fantastic. If you click on MS, it's going to link the controls and make them the same. So just be aware of that. If you set up something differently on these two and then you switch it here and you, so I'll show you if I move this here, you can see that it's now different on the mid and the side. If I move up here, it's now made them the same. You see, it kind of erases whatever difference you've made here, and they just become the same. So just be aware. Don't click on that unless you're sure you want to lose your separate settings. So maybe just a little thing I would suggest for an update is that it doesn't happen as soon as you hit this, that it happens when you move a control, that's what makes it. the same, so you don't like accidentally lose all your settings. But I suppose there might be pros and cons to that, and they probably thought that through and made a decision for good reason. And that's the thing I would say about this company, is that they have thought through so much detail on this. And it's so thoughtfully designed and very deep in, really slick, very professional. It's very aimed at, you know, anybody can just use it right away. But for the professional who really needs to get in and look at the details, it's like, it's really well thought through and really tightly implemented. Brilliantly done, I think. So they may have done this for good reason. So I'm not criticizing that at all. There may be a good reason why they've done that. But if not, then it might be worth thinking about that. So now we have this feedback and feed forward mode. This is in the hardware. And I won't spend too much time talking about the difference here, except that they sound different. It's a different way that the sidechain is looked at. It's looked at either before the compressor or it's looked at after it's been through the compressor. And that changes how the compressor reacts to the sidechain signal. And it gives it a noticeably different compression characteristic. They describe the feed forward. It's a more modern compressors have this as a more kind of aggressive, potentially aggressive sound. It depends how you set things. Obviously, it isn't necessarily aggressive, I would say. But it can bite and grab harder, you could say, if you set it that way, than the feedback, which is going to be a little smoother and a thicker sounding. They use the M word. They call it more musical sounding. I call it the M word because it's one of these words which just can mean kind of anything. And I'm not criticizing them, because I've read around the internet quite a bit about feedback and feed forward, and lots of articles use the M word to describe the difference between the two of them. But I would just caution that, like, what does that mean? I don't know. To me, it means, the way I hear it is, it's thicker and smoother sounding. The feedback, as opposed to the feed forward, is, in a way, to my ears, it's a little cleaner sounding, and you can be a little more precise with it. Transients will come through a bit more on the feedback, though. That's interesting. So, because it takes longer for it to hear the signal, so you get a little bit more, but I think that's not a huge difference. It's more the just overall tonal way the compressor works that's different. So, moving on. And I'll get back to this because there's more interesting stuff about this. That we're just about to hit now. So this is another section here. This section is not in the hardware, and this is one of the more powerful and innovative sections in the plugin. And they talk a lot about this in their literature, that this is possible because of the way they've modeled this. They really got in there and modeled it in such detail, the way the compression actually works, with the intricacies of how it reacts to incoming signal frequency content, dynamically changing frequency content, and how the release setting in particular is a complex one. And so is the knee, and how the knee changes depending on what else is happening in the compressor. It's all quite complex. It's not straightforward at all. And they spent a huge amount of time just really recreating that whole compression scheme in huge detail. And I have to say, they've done an amazing job on it. But because they did it in such detail and didn't just kind of model the kind of standard way of doing these things, they were able to get in there and change the saturation characteristic of the circuit within how the compressor works. Now, normally what happens is when you get a compressor with saturation control on it, which quite a lot of them have, they've simply just put a saturator before the compressor or after the compressor. And some of them let you change where it is. Most of them, they don't tell you. It's either happened before the compressor or it's happening after the compressor. So it's not the same thing at all as having that modeled in such a way that the amount and the quality of the saturation is changing depending on how the compressor is working from moment to moment and how it's reacting to different frequency content from moment to moment. That's a very complex thing. And it's a very dynamic thing. And you can only do that if the saturation is happening within the compressor circuit itself, and that's what they've done here. And that's why they've given you this section, because the way they modeled it allowed that to happen. So you can have the same compressor, basically characteristics from the API 2500, Or you can switch here and you get the same characteristics, but you've got a different saturation scheme. You've got something more like from a Verymu saturation scheme. Doesn't mean the Verymu compressor is going to work like a Verymu at all. It's still working just like the API 2500, but the saturation that goes on inside it is like a Verymu saturation. And that is going to change how the compressor works in subtle ways, because as the signal is saturated within how the compressor works, it changes how it works with that, because it changes saturation, changes the dynamic range, and it's all frequency dependent, so you get quite a complex thing going on there. So that changes the kind of whole tonal sound of the compressor. I would say it gives it kind of a thicker, gooier sound. The IPA is, of course you might hear it differently, you might describe it differently rather. The IPA is the original saturation of the hardware unit, and that I would say sounds kind of cleaner and more kind of open and precise sounding. And then the end diode is from a diode type saturation from diode type compressors. And this sounds significantly more crunchy, especially in the upper mids. So really useful to have this different sound, and it does change how it reacts to the signal because it's all right in the compression circuit. And then you've got a drive control, so you can drive how much of each of these saturations is in there, and you can drive it right into like an extreme saturation or just much more subtle shaping of the tone and shaping of the way the compressor is reacting within that. So really great, and you can switch it off here if you like. And that gives a huge amount of variation, tonal variation to this compressor, as we'll hear in some of the examples. Final bit here is of controls is the sidechain, and there is more to it up here, which I'll cover in a second. But this here gives you from the hardware these three different sidechain shapes. It's called punch because, like on the loud one, it's basically cutting away the lows, and so it's not going to react as much to low frequencies. So that could create a more punchy sound, and it is reacting a lot more to the higher frequencies and mids. So they're going to get smoothed out, whereas the impact bits are going to get less affected. And that can create a punchier sound depending on the source material. This is like a milder version of that, and this is with no sidechain emphasis there. Now, you can also do all of that up here, in a sense. You can actually do exactly the same thing here. You can actually switch that around here. But if I just turn that off for a second, which I have done on norm here, you can create your own sidechain here. And you've got low pass, you've got shelves, you've got high pass, low pass, which you can select here. It's basically a lot like Pro Q3 here, or any, parametric modern equalizer, and you can change the Q setting on all of these things. It's really versatile, really, really good. So you can just change your sidechain, do de-essing, have it only work on the low or only on the highs to whatever degree. Fantastically good. And this works on the sidechain signal before it hits the compressor. This, however, works within the compression circuit in the sense that if you've got it in feedback mode, it's in the feedback circuit. So it's going to change how the compressor reacts in a different way than this will. So just keep in mind they are different. If you have it on feed forward, they're not. Feedback, this is going to affect the way the compressor reacts because it's in the feedback circuit, whereas this never is. This is always just at the beginning before the compressor hears the sidechain signal. Finally, we've got here a look ahead. Obviously, you've got sidechain internal and external, and you can audition the sidechain, all very useful. But look ahead, you can set it so that it looks ahead at the signal. And so you could catch really fast transients that way, or you can go the other way so that it's late in looking at the signal, and you could tailor your attack, for example, really precisely with that. So really useful to have that. And then you've got what's really good metering here. And I won't go over the details of the metering, but just to tell you that it's the metering is very precise, and really, you'll see it's incredibly good. You can even look at mid and side separately, which is just, I don't think I've seen that in a compressor before. Really great, really, really useful. These things are great. I like these because they react really accurately. I often miss that in a compressor when the release is happening. The meter doesn't really track the release. I find in most software compressors, it doesn't really track it that well. So the release is set, quite fast, and you're watching the meter and it's not really coming down, or you set the release to a certain number of milliseconds and it's not really following that very accurately. This does. You can watch it and it really follows the release, which is just so useful. I mean, why have a meter if it's not going to show you something useful? So, great metering. Now, let's start having a listen to this. I'm just going to go in here and start working on listening to some of these. So, let me just, okay, set this up like this. So I'm going to, this is on the mix bus. I'm going to bypass this and then bring it in, and you can hear how it sounds on a bus setting. Now I've set the threshold high, so it's going to be digging in a lot more than I would, but I've set it high just because it makes it a lot easier, I think, on a YouTube video to hear what it's doing when you kind of over exaggerate it a bit. So just to keep that in mind. So I'll start with it out and then I'll bring it in. And just as a reminder, when this is yellow, it's bypassed, and when it's dark, it is engaged. So really gluey, thick. It really gives it a lot of thickness and density and really glues things nicely together, the way it's set. But it's very versatile. This compressor can do a lot of different types of things. Let's jump over now to another instance of this. And let's have a listen to this one. So really, again, nicely gluing it and also giving it some nice punch, especially in the low ends, tightening up that low end and giving that extra punchiness to the overall mix bus. Really nice. The last one I'll just mention, the one I played before this, it did have a fair amount of saturation going on. This one doesn't. And you can hear the difference in the thickness there. But I'm going to play around in a minute with the controls so you can actually hear more clearly what these things do. Let's just jump over to a third one here. So this, kind of like the name says, and these are presets that I made, it really gives a lot of weight and punch to that low end. And that's partially because there's a filter here on the low end, but it's also just the rest of the settings there that are giving some punch to the mids. So that's some on the mix bus. Let's jump over now to some individual instruments. Let's look at the snare. I find the snare is always really useful to look at in terms of understanding what a compressor can do. So I'm going to solo the snare. Actually, no, I think what I'll do is I'll solo the drums, but I will, so you can hear a little bit in context. But I'm going to mute the overheads just because there's so much snare coming through the overheads that you won't hear this working as well. So this is the kit without the overheads, and we're going to be concentrating, we're going to be compressing the snare. I'll start with it out. So you can hear how much extra body there is in the snare. It's not really affecting the transient much, and I'll show you why that is in a second. But it's really bringing it out. This snare does not have a lot of ring to it or anything like that. It's a snare that's quite a kind of deadened snare, and it sounds kind of thin in a way, without anything bringing out the body. And this is really bringing out the body of that snare. Have another listen again with it, with and without. Listen to the sustain of the snare. Start with it out. Really improves the sound of that snare in terms of the body part of it. So the way I've done that is it's quite a strong ratio. The threshold's high. You can see it's grabbing way down into the snare, and it would kill the snare if I had 100% mix, but I've only got 40% mix. So the transients of the snare, the attack of the snare is all coming through nice and loud. But as it releases, it's on a fast release, it's pulling up the body of the snare. And so you're not really taking away from the attack of the snare, even though it's set very fast and otherwise would be killing it. But it's because the mix is down at 40%, but it's really pulling up the body in relation to the attack. And I'm not going to go through every setting and why I set it the way I did, but there are other things here that kind of add to that. Just showing you really what this compressor can do. Let's move on to a different one now. Let's try this one. Hold on a second. Let's go over to the snare again here. Okay, now this one is going to be adding smack to the snare. So let's have a listen to this. So super smacky. And in a mix, a track like this, I think that could actually work quite well because it's quite a hard-hitting track, and it really the snare wants to kind of smack it quite hard, I think. So this is actually probably a setting I might well use in a song like this. So again, you can look at the settings. It's kind of interesting to see that even though I've got this on the fastest attack setting here, it's still letting through that smack, and that's because it's on feedback, which it's slightly slower to react, and it's got a fast release. But I have to say that there's quite a lot of, if you're after that sound for a particular track, that kind of smacky sound, you can get a lot of different variations of that sound on this. It's great for that, really good. So that's snare. Let's move over now. I'm going to turn this off again because I'm going to move over to the drum bus, and I don't want that kind of affecting the sound that the drum bus is going to be doing. So let's have a look at the drum bus here, starting with this one here. Start with it out, and then I'll bring it in. So it's an example of how you can absolutely kill it and just let the transients through. Let's try this one here. So there's an example of an MS setting. It's got quite an extreme, if you look at what we've got on the mid here, it's grabbing that snare pretty hard in the mid. Ratio is up at 6, and it's really giving it some real punch and smack, and the kick as well. That would just kill the cymbals if I had it on normal stereo mode. But because I can switch to different settings for the mid and the side, here you've got way down here on a much lower ratio, and the release is slower, and so it's acting very differently on the sides, and so it gives you this big wide stereo spread on the drum kit. You can hear when I bring it in and out, it's much wider, but it's adding punch and snap to the kick and snare while smoothness to the cymbals. I mean, that's fantastic. That you can do that with one compressor, because it'd be pretty damn tricky to do that in any other way if you didn't have MS control. You couldn't just put 2 compressors in series and do something like that. It wouldn't work. So that's an example of what the mid side can do. And what have we got here? This is one where we've got the diode setting, so you can hear what that's like. So this is also using the clipper, and you can see that because of the blue. The blue bits there show you it's being clipped, and it's pre the mix control, so it's sitting between the makeup and the mix here, and it's adding some of that diode saturation here to the snare, so it's giving it that quite a crunchy upper mid going on there. Again, useful if you want a kind of more aggressive style. So what I'm going to do now is I'm going to move back over to the mix bus and mess about with the controls, so you can hear what it's like if I actually start moving the controls around a bit, and then we'll go and listen to something else in a minute. So hopefully that's given you a good idea of what I can do on the mix bus. As always, I'm way overdoing it most of the time just to make it obvious what the thing's doing. If I was doing it really subtle and spending the time to get it exactly right, you wouldn't get that kind of full kind of run through of what all the controls do. So just keep that in mind. But hopefully that was useful in hearing the kind of things that happen when I start moving the controls around. I went through a pretty wide variety of different things. Okay, so here we are with some vocals. And I'm going to have a listen to this vocal without anything, and I'm going to bring it in, and I'll play it through with a couple of different presets that I've made for this vocal, and then I'll mess with the controls just so you can hear some variations. So I'll start with it out, and then I'll bring it in.
Understand what she could have done to make herself the one, hold you tenderly.
So it's jumping out pretty strongly on those loud bits. So I'll put it in now.
Understand what she could have done to make herself the one, hold you tenderly.
So completely controlled. That's one of the nice things about VCA compressors, I find, is they can really control things like quite really firmly, more firmly than some other types of compressors I find. Sometimes too firmly, but this is to me sounding pretty good. Now I'm overdoing it hugely again. With a vocal, I almost always have two, sometimes more compressors, each one doing a little bit. I would never take one compressor and slam it this hard, because I just think you get a better result with less being done by, two or sometimes more compressors in series. And sometimes different types of compressors, or in fact usually different types of compressors. So this one compressor doing all of this heavy lifting is not something I'd normally do, but the fact that it's doing it this well, I think, is a testament to the compressor. A lot of compressors would just completely sound squashed with that much compression going on. So I have to say I'm impressed. I'm very impressed by how it's handling this vocal with the amount of compression I'm throwing at it, which is a lot. So I'm going to play that again, and then I'll switch to a different preset, just so you can hear that, and then I'll start messing with the controls. So I'll start again with it out and then bring it in.
Stand to make herself the one, hold you tenderly. 'Cause I remember last year on this day, you and I would dance the night away. Everything was new, all the world was you. You were holding me. The air is filled with music. The rhythm is exotic. Understand what she could have done to make herself the one, hold you tenderly. 'Cause I remember last year on this day, you and I would dance the night away. Everything was new, all the world was you. You were holding me. The air is filled with music. The rhythm is exotic. Understand what she could have done to make herself the one, hold you tenderly. 'Cause I remember last year on this day, you and I would dance the night away. Everything was new, all the world was you. You were holding me. The air is filled with music. The rhythm is exotic. Understand what she could have done to make herself the one, hold you tenderly. 'Cause I remember last year on this day, you and I would dance the night away. Everything was new, all the world was you. You were holding me. The air is filled with music. The rhythm is exotic. Understand what she could have done to make herself the one hold you tenderly. 'Cause I remember last year on this day, you and I would dance the night away. Everything was new, all the world was you. You were holding me. The air is filled with music. The rhythm is exotic. Understand what she could have done to make herself the one hold you tenderly. 'Cause I remember last year on this day, you and I would dance the night away. Everything was new, all the world was you. You were holding me. The air is filled with music. The rhythm is exotic. Understand what she could have done to make herself the one hold you tenderly. 'Cause I remember last year on this day, you and I would dance the night away. Everything was new, all the world was you. You were holding me. The air is filled with music. The rhythm is exotic. Understand what she could have done to make herself the one hold you tenderly. 'Cause I remember last year on this day, you and I would dance the night away. Everything was new, all the world was you. You were holding me. The air is filled with music.
So a big range of different really nice sounding vocal compressions. And again, just to remind you, a compressor having to do this much heavy lifting on a vocal, and this is quite a dynamic vocal and it needs controlling in a mix to sit in a mix properly. I mean, you know, most vocals would, most compressors, if you put that much compression on, would just completely sound crushed. And this is doing a fantastic job of not doing that and yet controlling the vocal and bringing out the nice elements of the tone of the vocal in various different ways, depending on what I was doing at the time. I was impressed by how well it sounded, how well it handled the vocal with a variety of different tones and settings. Really a lot of variation here, especially when you start messing around with the saturation and various sidechain EQs, bringing out different qualities and aspects of the tone of the vocal. So, in summary, I think this is an excellent compressor. It's a really accurate emulation of an API 2500, but it takes it so much further. It's like a dream compressor within the VCA, 2500 kind of ballpark, because it takes it so far beyond what that actual compressor can do with all of these options and variations. Absolutely fantastic. And I have to say, they've done a tremendous job of making it sound really, really detailed, analog sounding, really full of richness and very controllable. So great job, Pulsar, I have to say, on this. And it's something I will definitely be using as in my my template toolkit of compressors. So yeah, highly recommended. Very versatile, fantastic compressor. So I hope you found this useful. And if you did, don't forget to give the video a like and ring the bell and subscribe. And if you can contribute to the channel, that press the thanks button. That is hugely appreciated. And all of those things help the channel keep going. So hope to see you next time.